Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you to the MSDA Foundation and MSDA. Specifically, thanks to Eric and Lauren over at the MSDAF for helping to put this together. It's always a privilege to partner with the foundation, and we appreciate the invitation to share information about this topic, transitions and valuing dental practices in 2021. Certainly been a crazy year leading up to this, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions regarding valuations and transitions with regards to the near future and beyond, and how our last 12 months and plus have affected things. We're going to hold questions, if you would, type them in as you have them, and then we'll be getting to them at the end of the discussion. Matt and I are going to keep this really conversational. We're going to kind of bounce back and forth a little bit, but I think to start out, we'll give you just kind of a synopsis of what we're going to go over, a little bit of an introduction between myself and Matt, and then get into some of the meat of the topic. In general, we're going to give you an overview of the landscape of what's going on with transitions. What we're seeing with sellers and buyers. We're going to discuss banks and what they're doing with regards to funding practice acquisitions. Matt's going to dive into practice valuations and probably focus a fair amount on how they're approaching, he and his firm are approaching the craziness of 2020. I'm sure along the way we'll share a little bit of opinion here and there from our perspective of touching so many different corners of the dental industry. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Todd Garfinkel, and my wife Cheryl and I are two of the owners of DDS Match Transitions. Although the company is nationwide, we have folks in 40 states. We have 30 professionals across the country. Cheryl and I live and work out of Annapolis. And so we're local to Maryland. We help doctors in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. We center our business around a couple of key principles, one of the main ones being transparency. We're real big on finding the right fit for each of the projects, each of the practices that we're working with. We're centered also on helping doctors who are selling their practice, transitioning their practice to meet their goals, right? Both financially as well as who's going to take over their legacy that they've built and what's going to work for them, their staff, and their patients. We strive to have professionalism across the board. And in the end, I think it's important for us to let the clients we work with know that they're in control of the direction that the process will take. We'll guide it, we'll advise along the way, but it's important for us to fulfill the vision of the sellers that we represent. And we do only represent sellers of the practice, although we do speak a great deal to buyers. In working through what we work on in the industry here, in the transition industry, we're lucky enough to touch a whole lot of different corners of the dental industry. And of course, we're working with selling doctors, both those who are ready to move ahead and those that are considering a year, 2 year, 3, 5 years out, and they want to talk and kick around ideas and get an understanding what that's going to look like. A lot of work with bankers. We're touching dozens, literally, of bankers and communicating with them regularly, so we're understanding what their take is on the market and what their process is for lending. Work a fair amount with lawyers, of course, accountants, distributor reps, consultants, insurance representatives, lease negotiators, you name it, we're touching them. So we're able to keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on in the industry as a whole, not just in our little corner, so to speak, but we get to see a pretty good pretty good bandwidth of what's going on in dental. You know, I'm happy to share that the overall energy around practice transitions has been and continues to be very high. It's been extremely active from both the seller and the buyer perspective. And I think in moving forward, we're going to see it actually increase even more. As I mentioned, one of the foundations of how Cheryl and I and DDS Match as a whole manage practice transition is through transparency. And in fostering that, we utilize a third-party accounting firm, one of the top 10 in the country when it comes to healthcare, a company called Blue & Co, Blue & Company Accounting. And we use them for a third-party independent certified business valuation that establishes kind of a true market value of the practice. And with that, I'd like to introduce Matt Howard, pass the mic over to him, so to speak, and let Matt tell you about himself and tell you about Blue & Company. There you go, Matt.
Thanks, Todd. Good morning, everybody. I'm Matt Howard. I'm a senior manager at Blue & Company. I'm located in the Midwest, but I work nationally. You know, I'm a little bit of a very specific CPA. You know, I don't do the bookkeeping. I don't do the taxes. Like all your personal accountants are probably very busy doing right now. All I do is transactions, and even more specifically, my entire world is dental. So I think last year, we haven't tallied it up fully, but we did over 300 dental valuations last year and worked in other several capacities, including I'm a buyer's representative. I help buyers walk through the process from A to Z, help them understand what they're buying, is it a good deal, and then help them kind of navigate all the things that they've got to do in order to get ready for that first day of ownership. So Blue is a top 60 CPA firm, but like Todd said, we're probably one of the top 10 firms from a healthcare perspective. We have teams that have nurses. We have nurses on staff that support hospitals from a coding perspective, from a valuation perspective, and from all the other aspects of healthcare in the larger side. But again, myself and our team has a significant portion of our individuals that focus specifically on dentistry. And, you know, so we have this 300 or so specific dental clients that we do the taxes and books for as well. But again, specifically, I work with Todd and a lot of other DDS Match brokers around the nation to help facilitate what I call true professional, transparent transactions. And so really my core value is helping you as a seller or as a buyer truly understand what is the market demanding for a practice that you're looking at or you own today. And again, trying to take the emotion out of it, trying to just really come in as that third party that gets paid exactly the same amount for every business valuation I do, and truly help you understand what is a fair price from both a buyer and a seller perspective for the practice. Again, there's some other entities out there that set their own prices, and it's a one-pager and you have no idea how that value is determined. That is not how I like to handle the process. We have a very full valuation, 60 pages or more, depending on the practice, that helps detail exactly how we arrive at the value. Again, transparency and intentionality is something that I love to bring to a transaction.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. And it is an extremely robust valuation that they put together. And one of the wonderful things is that as we do those with Blue & Company, and Matt is wide open. And in fact, in every case with the seller, we hop on a Zoom call and review the business valuation to make sure that each of the pieces are in line with what they understand as far as the practice and the numbers that were provided. Review the process, and how they came about the value that they did. And then same with buyers, right, Matt?
Exactly. I mean, jumping on the phone with them and helping them understand what the value is and how I got there, and here's the things that we considered, and they can ask questions. And sometimes they have their CPA on the phone too, and that CPA will ask questions. Again, there's nothing to hide here. We're trying to make it completely above board, transparent, open and honest about everything that went into the valuation and how the value was determined.
Yeah, yeah. Again, transparency, and that's kind of what I think why DDS Match aligns so well with what Matt and his team and Blue and Company do. You know, as I mentioned, lenders are a big part of transitions, in that, of course, they're supplying the money in most cases. They play a major role, a key role, and quite honestly, if they're not lending money, most transitions aren't happening. They're definitely lending money right now. I'm going to give you a little kind of an overview of what we're seeing with banks, with lenders, and you know, from a general point of view, we're seeing most of them starting to loosen up a little bit. So during the heart of this COVID fiasco that we've dealt with, there were varying degrees of open lending. Most of them were lending money, but they had tightened up their requirements. But right now they're definitely funding dental practice sales, and they're eager to. I mean, they're actually hunting down and aggressively pursuing transition deals, if you would. There's some common themes in how the banks are approaching loans, but at the same time, we see each bank have a little bit of a uniqueness to their own. Some of the common themes that we're seeing with banks, just to give you kind of sort of perspective, both from the seller's point of view and the buyer's perspective. In general, they're looking for practices to be back to a substantial amount of where they were pre-COVID. They're not taking 2020 as a whole in considering it, because it was so up and down and roller coastery, right? Not only did we have a shutdown, but then we had this surge coming back into opening up the offices, and then things kind of dropped and then leveled out, and up and down. So instead of taking the whole as a year, what most banks are doing is taking monthly P&Ls. So they might request the entire of 2019 and 2020 in monthly P&Ls, and that allows them to compare month over month, year 2020 to year 2019, and see where the practice is in relative terms to pre-COVID. What they're mostly looking for are practices to be in the 80 to 90 or above % of where they were in pre-COVID. And that kind of satisfies them from the practice's perspective. When it comes down to the actual closing of the deal, like keys are going to be handed off to the buyer, and the money is going to be wired or transferred to the seller. They're going to look back in the previous 60 to 90 days just before that point and verify that the practice is still on track and still doing relatively well compared to 2019. And Matt, I know you got a kind of a different, larger view with banks and funding. Any pieces you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd summarize it kind of to two different pieces that I've seen a larger focus on from the financial institutions. Again, in general, there's a lot of them out there. They're all a little bit different in their models and their risk appetite. But at the end of the day, lending for dental is still extremely strong and healthy. And I'd say 100% financing is the rule, not the exception. Good news is rates are really low, and we think they're going to stay that way for at least a while longer. But as the economy, depending on how stimulus affects it, interest rates could go up, so that could affect some of our transactions. But right now, rates are, lower than they've been in almost everybody's, lifetime on this call. I would say that the two major items that I would focus on today is banks always required some sort of liquidity from a buyer perspective. I'd say that those requests or those requirements have kind of increased depending on the practice. Obviously, banks are still looking at what is the cash flow or how are the economics of the specific practice that they're funding. That is bar none the most important thing, but they are starting to look at the balance sheet, if you will, or the cash reserves of these buyers to make sure that they are not cutting it too tight in ownership, and just making sure they have some sort of buffer in case the practice does go soft for a couple months if we have another surge or something from COVID. And the only other thing that the banks are really requesting, and this is a lot from the seller side, is data. They really are looking for more data than they did pre-COVID than they did post-COVID. So they're just looking for understanding, reassurance that the practice is still continuing to at least trend or be at consistent with 2019 numbers than it was in 2020.
Yeah, and Matt, I was going to jump in, but didn't want to interrupt you. We actually had a conversation with a national manager of a fairly large lender. It's like in the third largest lender for dental a couple days ago, and found out that they are seriously considering adjusting the liquidity requirement. So they were firm at, hey, the buyer has to have 10% liquidity, not for a down payment, but for a just to give the bank the understanding that they've been prudent, that they have a cushion to fall back on, so liquid funds somewhere available, that they're going to look at adjusting that now. It's not a hard 10, but they're going to go to a range of between 5 and 10, depending on the deal and depending on the buyer. So we're seeing things starting to even loosen up more and kind of go back to where they were completely pre-COVID. So again, it's been very robust. There's not been an issue or concern in getting funding. They're just tightened up the requirements a little bit. And some, it still is true from each of the bank's perspectives that they're going to look at what's called the global cash flow. And it's a global cash flow analysis. And they come up with a ratio. And that's what that's all about, is that they're going to look at the buyer's expenses personally, right? So their personal expenses. They're going to look at the practice's expenses as they've been established and consistent, taking away personal items that are run through the finances for the practice, like auto or health insurance or various items that have been a choice to run through the practice that are necessary for the practice to run. So they're going to look at these two categories of expenses, and they're going to look at the revenue or the earnings from the practice. And then they're going to come up with a ratio, and they want to be at 1.25 to 1.4, that formula comes together to establish. And that meets their criteria for, okay, this looks healthy, this looks good, we've got a green light to go ahead and lend. But I agree, Matt, I'm seeing still 100% of the deal being financed. Sorry about that. 100% of the deal being financed. In general, banks are going to lend 80 to 85% of the prior year's gross collections as a benchmark of how much money they will lend, but they lend 100% of the deal. That's where that month-to-month comparison comes in, and they're going to adjust accordingly for pre-COVID and current and recent performance. As any of the buyers that might be on this call today, I would encourage you to reach out, start a conversation, start a relationship with a bank or two. It's never too soon. You want to understand what they're looking for. You want to understand their personality, how helpful they're going to be, what's the bank's profile. It's not all about the rate and the term. They're going to be pretty competitive from one bank to the other. But of course, there's always an option to compare and leverage, if you will. But in general, take a look at, what are they, start the conversation and start to understand what's going to be needed in order to go through the process of a practice acquisition. And that's going to allow you to feel more comfortable with what's going to be ahead for you once you find that practice and you've already established a relationship with a banker to go to. And once you find that practice, then you're good to go and ready to move, and you've got somebody in your corner already. You know, to go over a little bit of what we're seeing from a buyer's point of view in the last year and current, again, you know, if we look back the last 6, 7, 8 months, very good level of buyer activity. It surprises a lot of people, but there's actually been a very robust and active buyer pool out there for practices. You know, it still holds true that if a practice is in a rural setting, it's going to take longer to attract a buyer than if it's in a more metro area. And that's just the nature of, I think, the buyers today, that they're looking for that more cultural center, or some sort of a more, you know, to raise a family in their minds, in an environment that's going to allow for the schools that they want, the exposure to the cultural centers, proximity to you know, the busy, active centers of society. But in most cases, there's always a buyer for a practice. It's just a matter of finding that right fit and find the right one. You know, I think a lot of buyers have been, with this situation over the last year, been pushed to reevaluate, not just buyers, but everybody, reevaluate their current situation, right? If they're an associate for a practice and they had to be shut down and laid off for a while past when practices opened up because of the economics involved, you know, they're starting to think, hey, wait, you know, maybe it'd be better to be my own boss, to be my own captain of my ship. And it really, we're seeing a lot of buyers accelerating their plans, where they might have said, hey, listen, I'm going to buy a practice in 3 to 5 years. They're they're pushing that ahead and diving into the process. You know, it gives them a different level of security, a different level of autonomy, versus working for somebody else. And you mentioned, Matt, earlier, you do a fair amount of buyer representation, and you probably have even a little bit deeper view of what how buyers are behaving than we do. Why don't you chime in here, if you would, if you don't mind?
Yeah. Well, like you said, I think there's been a lot of buyer activity. You know, some of that was due to some of the DSOs that probably were greatly impacted by COVID. Some of them shut down practices, and there was some disruption from you know, an employee associateship perspective. And I think that drove some of those buyers to the market. I think, you know, there's other factors involved too, and I won't go too deeply into them, but I do think there's a lot of buyer activity. And I think maybe some of those buyers got interested to think, hey, maybe I can get a very good deal on a practice, maybe initially. And we might have found that for some practices where dentists decided they did not want to go back to the post-COVID world. And that was definitely the exception to the rule, though. I would say that lasted about 2 months, where we unfortunately worked on some very not fun transactions, Todd, where, you know, we had dentists that just didn't want to go back. And, you know, obviously that impacts value when, you know, the lifeblood of the practice has paused, and it adds uncertainty to the transaction. But again, that was a very small sample of the couple hundred transactions that I've been involved with over the last year. You know, buyers are coming to the table, and they are asking some good questions. And I'll talk about this later when we talk about valuation. They really want to understand the data, and their representatives do too, to help them get as good of a picture of what they're buying and how COVID impacted the practice. That is probably number one thing on the minds of both banks and for buyers, right? You know, buyers are interested because they understand that there is opportunity right now to make a change and to own a practice and to, benefit from the ownership of the practice. So walking with buyers through the process, again, like we talked about with the lending section, is there's more hoops to jump through. There is definitely a need for a buyer to, even just connect with those banks even before they find the right practice, get acquainted for them so that they can get the process started and they understand how the process works after they do find that right practice. Because like you said, Todd, practices in good areas, they're not going slow. I think the most desirable areas are still very healthy from a transaction time perspective, in that they're not sitting on the market for weeks upon weeks. They go pretty fast. So if you are a buyer, I do think it is important for you to build a team so that you can hit the ground running when you identify that right practice that you want to make an offer on. If it is in a area that is, where a lot of buyers want to live and work and have their career at, I think it's important for you to be kind of primed and ready to jump in and to move the process along as quickly as possible. The biggest thing that I try to advise the buyers on is that this is a transaction. There's absolutely money involved, and it's very important that, again, if it's a non-DDS match deal where we're working off a broker's opinion of value, which is much different than a valuation, it's important that we kick the tires and make sure we're not, paying for something that isn't there, or if it's not fair, that we negotiate the price down. But again, if the price is fair and we have a third-party valuation that seems to be reasonably done, I think one of the biggest things that I try to help buyers understand is that this is not a used car transaction. And it's not that we don't want to get as good of a deal as we can get, but we also need to understand the impact of the deal from an emotional perspective for the seller, and that you want the seller on your team. You want to make this transaction not a used car transaction where we negotiate for 6 months and we go back to the table over and over again trying to get the price down. I think it's very important that a buyer understands that this is an important process where the legacy of the seller is being transitioned, and that relationship is very important. So every time we ask for some sort of concession, we just need to understand the emotional cost of that negotiation. Other than that, Todd, and unless there's something else I think of in the next few minutes, I think those are some of the biggest areas. Is again, I still think we're in those hot areas. We're in a seller's market, as in there's not a lot of inventory sitting out there waiting to be transacted on. And then, as you said, rural and maybe hour and a half outside of major metropolitan areas is kind of what I consider semi-rural. Those practices do sit for a little bit longer, just because it takes a longer period to find the right buyer.
No, Matt, and I agree completely with the points you're making. We saw the same thing at the beginning, where there were some folks looking for fire sales and practices. Universally across the country, we saw values of practices staying the same, holding true. There were some instances where sellers just wanted to get out, and negotiations went down that road in that way. But in general, there's no doubt that practices held their value through the core of this COVID deal that we went through, and is still going through. In the end, I think buyers just want to be reassured that what they're buying is the value that they're expecting. We work hard to remind them and keep it in the forefront of their mind that the core of what they're purchasing is goodwill. And just to your point, Matt, that's the piece that they're buying, and that's what we all need to aim to preserve. We strive to create a win-win situation in our deals. Again, we represent the seller, but we do a lot of communication with buyers. And in that communication, that's what we're aiming for. Our core is, hey, listen, we're more about making this a transition than we are about making it a transaction. And transaction is really important, don't get me wrong. But we lead with the fit and the transition and the goodwill, and that's really what's being purchased. And that's to your point, Matt. So I couldn't align more with your thinking. And I think most of the folks who get dental transitions at a core level would express that same idea and the same feeling. We continue to see buyers be really strong. There's like I said, a good active pool. They're looking for that job satisfaction. They understand that the ultimate goal is to own their own practice. For most the buyers out there, most of the dentists out there looking for either a job or for to purchase a practice. They understand that ultimately they want to be an owner and have their own place. So it's been really active and it's been fantastic. So Matt, maybe this would be a good point for you to dive into what you guys are doing from a valuation perspective. Considering the fun we've had in 2020 and looking forward, how you're going to view that coming into 2021 and beyond.
Yeah, well, I know everybody on this webinar signed up to hear a CPA talk about valuation on a Friday. Cruel and unusual punishment, in my opinion, but I'll try to make this as painless as possible because it is a big deal. And it is going to be one year to be evaluator, as in the number one issue in valuing practices today is data integrity. And what I mean by that is we had a year that just had such disruption from a data perspective. And when I mean data, I mean income and expenses at dental practices, right? So, most parts of the country had some, impact on March, April, and May. Typically the months that we're seeing, where obviously we were either shut down for a period of time or all of that time, depending on where you're at in the country or your risk appetite for COVID at that time. And so, we had 3 months where the valve closed, and we basically just did some emergencies. We had money coming in from prior procedures, accounts receivable that came in during that time. And then all of a sudden we reopen and we try to figure out what all the procedures are for COVID and how we're going to handle it. We just issued our 2020 dental survey, and one component of that survey was to talk about, practices and their impact on COVID. One interesting thing is that 1 out of 3 practices per our data added some amount of time to a pro fee visit. So again, that goes back to operational, getting back into the swing of things and how does practice operate, after that May time period when we reopened. But in the end, what I've seen over and over again, and I've probably worked on, 200 or so valuations since the closure, is, we came back very strong in most cases, as long as the dentist or the ownership was, interested in, getting back in earnest. So we had 3 or 4 months of just better numbers than most practices have seen in general in their entire existence. And that's that pin-up demand, us trying to, the industry trying to make up for 2 lost months or 3 lost months, depending on where you're at in the country. So here we have, 2 normal months at the beginning of the year before COVID really hit. We have 2 or 3 months that were very impacted by COVID and shutdowns. And then we have 3 or 4 or 5 months of insane activity. And then we have the 6-month anniversary from a hygiene recall perspective of COVID. And then, so 2 more months of, some practices still were very busy during that time. Some were a little bit softer. In the end, we have all this ups and downs in the integrity of the data. And it's just going to make for a lot more looking at that data and making sure that whatever we use in our valuation is really the expectation of what is going to continue on in the practice post-COVID. And again, with the cases going down, obviously we're all hoping and optimistic that no new variants are going to push us back up again. But at the end of the day, you know, trying to figure out what is going to happen in the future is definitely the hardest part of valuing practices today. So what are we doing? Practically, what does that mean? We are taking each month, and the profit and loss statement is basically the revenues minus the expenses, and that shows what the profitability of the practice. We are trying, in any case where we can get this type of data from the practice, we are trying to get each month of data for all of 2020. And that way, what we can do is we can parse out those months that were most impacted by COVID. And what we can do is we can take out, let's say all 3 months were a wash for your practice, March, April, and May. We'll take those out, take those 3 months out, and either tack on some of 2021 that we already have finalized, or going back into 2019 and adding on maybe November and December of that year. That way we can have 12 full months of data without the craziness of those 2 or 3 months, which again, Lord willing, we will never have happen again where we're shut down in that capacity. So that is kind of how we're using 2020 data in our valuations. Now, we may weigh some of 2019 and some of 2020 in our analysis. It doesn't mean we're just going to use 2020. We might use 2019 as well as a balance of those two in determining what is the new economics of the practice. Now, just as a high level though, after looking at a lot of practices, unless the seller really didn't want to get back in earnest, what I've seen over and over again, that even if you just look at 2020 from January to December, most practices were either proportionally down for the amount of years, so 15% of the year or so they were closed. They're either down by that 15% or they made up for it. I'm seeing over and over and over again, a lot of practices had their best year ever, even without making any adjustments in 2020 or close to 2019 performance. So what that tells me is, my expectations for the industry going forward from a valuation perspective, from an economic perspective, is it seems that most practices are intact or even trending slightly better than they were pre-COVID. Now, is that sustainable? I don't know. How's the economy going to be 2 years from now? I don't know. What I do know is we have seen a lot of stimulus that has, from my reading of analysts a lot smarter than me and economic people that are a lot smarter than me, have said that we kind of expect that there's going to be growth in the economy in the next 12 months. So again, I don't have a great crystal ball on what the world is going to do, but what I do see is that at least in 2020 and in early parts of 2021 perspective, is a lot of practices are very trending very well. And that kind of goes back to valuations are pretty much intact. There's really not been any significant degradation in the values of practices. Now, at the beginning of COVID, we did have some structural changes in some capacity to where perhaps there was some sort of holdback. So let's say that you value a practice for $1 million and the buyer agrees to that, but says, I'm going to hold 200,000 of that million and pay you out over time just to make sure that the practice recovers. That was early COVID. I have not seen anything like that recently. I'd say that most deals are still, you sign the papers, you pay the money, and then there's a transition period for the seller, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, depending on what the buyer and the seller wants. But at the end of the day, the transaction does not linger for years, or there's no real holdback in any of the deals that I'm seeing. So from a valuation component, I feel like the valuations, again, are substantially similar to what they were pre-COVID. As long as the practice has shown that it was either proportionally down based on the amount of closure, or even some have been completely intact in 2020. So again, data integrity is a big deal. a component of that I always like to speak on whenever I have an opportunity is to keep your books clean. And what I mean by that is, if you are thinking about transitioning or selling your practice in the next couple of years, please get the Maserati off your books. Please clean up anything that is non-operational in your books. The clearer you can tell the story of what your practice is doing, helps a buyer, a bank, a business valuator like Matt Howard to really understand what are the true operations of your practice, not not what we bought at Sam's Club, that might have some uses for home. Again, all these things that just really cloud the picture of how is your practice doing. So I always like to throw that in whenever I can. I would say that focus on, if you are a seller, or just know that the way that buyers are looking at practices right now is, what is the story of the practice right now? Again, have you not really come back and reactivated patients after COVID? Well, guess what? It shows in the numbers. If you haven't in earnest come back and really tried to get your recall program up and running and making sure there's people in the seats and the schedule is full, it shows up in the numbers. Or is your practice showing that it's doing better than it ever has? Again, that story is important from a valuation perspective, because if I see you were $1 million practice in 2019 and you're a $500,000 practice in 2020, unless there was extraneous or outside the normal reasons for that to happen, it is going to impact your valuation. But in the end, 90% of the practices that I've looked at have either been proportionally down or even better than they were prior to 2019. And obviously their values have not been impacted at all. One thing to kind of, on top of a cruel and unusual year of 2020, I did see a lot of practices have some sort of turnover during COVID. And I think as an industry, hygiene especially has been difficult, because there were some individuals that did leave the profession just due to COVID and not wanting to be in people's mouths during this time. I would say that has an impact on valuation as well. As long as you've been able to replace those people at similar rates, it should not impact your value too strongly. But we did, again, a part of our dental survey was asking, respondents, how many staff members did you lose? I would say the majority of practices based on our data at least lost one, some lost two full-time staff people, which again has training costs and again, in a very tough year anyway, getting those people engaged in your practice, was difficult as well. I think that's all the things that I kind of had prepared. Again, as we open up for questions here in a little bit, I do look forward to answering any specific questions, and I'll do my best to answer them with the information that I have.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. Appreciate it. It's a good view, a good look at how you guys are approaching it, and seems reasonable and on track with everything that we think and feel as well. And of course, we look to you guys as the experts in that area of valuations. To continue along that line, what we're seeing from a seller's perspective, again, very busy time in the last 6, 7, 8 months, and it continues to be extremely busy. We have locally, we have 22 listings with 5 practices under letter of intent, and another one expected early next week, which is a good level of activity. I mean, it's very consistent, and very, very positive. We saw a lot of, I'll share this first, but we did see a number of dentists that decided, hey, I've been thinking about retiring in the next year, 2 years, 3 years. Given what's going on, I think I'm just going to pull the trigger. Now's the time. given that they've been practicing 20, 30, 40, in some cases 50 plus years, facing the extra PPE and circumstances, they were just ready to pull the trigger and step out. We've also had a great deal of folks, of sellers, dentists considering selling the practice, approach us just for conversations. And we're always wide open to that. We enjoy giving back to the dental industry that's really essentially given us so much over the years of working within that field. So we're always open to a conversation. And sometimes it's a dentist who's thinking might be 5 years out, and we're happy to have a conversation with them about it. As Matt alluded to, one of the important pieces that we drive home is try not to let the practice production slide if you can help it. As the practice production slides and collection drops, so does the value of the practice, based on a cash flow analysis. So that's one of the pieces we'll encourage sellers to try to maintain if they can. Take a look at the practice through the patient's eyes, as somebody else visiting the practice might see. We have a tendency as humans to get used to our environment and not pick up on what others might see because it becomes commonplace to us. So it's important to try to take a different perspective of your practice. And just like as you are when you're selling your home, if you have a carpet that's in terrible shape, if you replace it, it's not necessarily going to change the value of the house, but it's certainly going to change the impression of what buyers come away with. And that's the same with dental practices. Adding or sprucing up or updating the practice isn't necessarily going to add dollar for dollar. It's not going to add value necessarily to the sale, but it's going to be more attractive to buyers who look at it and consider it. So that's something to think about. Matt, I'm going to hand the mic over to you again and just get your perspective on sellers and what you're seeing from the seller pool, if you would, sellers activity. What do you guys?
Yeah, I think you're on it. I think that COVID has been an instigator for practice transitions. Now, initially, it was not as much fun. Again, like I said, some more of the I gotta be done today type thing, which is never as much fun. But again, I think some people woke up and realized, you know what, I have to figure out when my exit point is, and maybe it's sooner than later based on what's going on in the world. And again, I've got an 80-year-old client. I've got an 85-year-old dentist that's still practicing today, that loves it. And again, practice, sell on your terms though. And like you said, Todd, what the valuations that are not as much fun is what I call the slow fade valuations. It was $1 million practice back in 2017, and every year, a couple more weeks of vacation, maybe trim a day, hours, maybe stop really pushing some of the dentistry that they think should be done. And at the end of the day, it ends up being a $700,000 or $600,000 practice by the time that we look at it. And that slow fade absolutely impacts the value of the practice. And if you've bought anything from a business perspective, or back when the sellers on the call bought their practice, that matters. What have you done for me recently is what the buyers are looking at most of the practices today. So if it's a $600,000 practice and it was $1 million practice 4 years ago, that doesn't matter as much to them. They look at it as a $600,000 practice, and so do the banks. So I think you're absolutely on point with the slow fade kind of concept. Sellers are still out there. I do think this has been a big instigator to get a lot of them engaged. And again, I do think we're in the seller's market still, but that could flip depending on how many sellers wake up. I mean, the practice ownership age is still very high on average. We do have older owners of dental practices just based on, the baby boomer generation still owns the majority of practices. So there will be a lot of activity over the next 10 years or more, as as the baby boomers do exit practice ownership and from a general perspective. But right now, I still, again, reiterate that in strong areas, practices do still go very quickly.
Great, agreed. It's interesting. I actually have, we have two clients right now, two sellers that are 82 and 83 years old, respectively. And then we also have two sellers that are in their 30s, which just kind of points towards people reevaluating their life and saying, okay, what do I really want to do? Is this right for me? I mean, I think in general, this COVID situation has spurred a lot of thinking about what do I want to do with my life and what's important to me. We continue to see the dental transition industry being extremely robust, and we're happy about that. As kind of wrap up thoughts, Matt, I'm going to throw a few things out there. I don't know if you want to add a few in there too. I think we're looking out into the future, expecting things to get even busier than they are now from both a seller and a buyer perspective. As the COVID situation starts to sunset, as more and more people are feeling comfortable about the situation, we're expecting more people to be ready to sell their practices. There's a group I do firmly believe that have held off because they're not aware of how active the current market is, that there are buyers out there looking. And so I think there's a number of sellers who have been just, bearing down and making it through in order to get to the other side. And then they're going to investigate and follow the process of transitioning the practice. If you are considering selling your practice, either currently or in the next few years, it's a great time to start having a conversation with your trusted advisors, with your team, so to speak, your CPA, your lawyers, your consultants, a good solid dental broker, even if it's a ways out. It's important to start to have those conversations. If you have a plan in place, things are going to go a whole lot better than if you're just kind of working from a more immediate perspective. And we're very, very happy to have conversations years in advance in order to advise and coach. And I know the other professionals that we're associated with feel the same way. Even in the best of times, even in normal times, a dental transition is a very complex process. Having a plan is key, as I mentioned. But it's even probably more important right now in the midst of what we're coming out of, to have a good solid plan of your exit. And as I mentioned, we're always available to have that conversation. Just as a side note, something that we do pretty regularly, we're pretty busy with it, is that we help dentists with associate placement. And we're seeing the associate market start to open back up too. I think as COVID was upon us in the core, obviously still upon us, but in the heat of it, a lot of offices contracted, and the idea of an associate or even keeping an associate on was not very favorable. And we're starting to see that loosen up. So we're starting to see a fair amount of activity with the associate placement side of things. And we're more than happy to help determine, and in some ways we'll utilize Matt and his team to determine if the practice is a good fit for an associate. And also, of course, help through the process in locating an associate and sourcing them for you to consider. Matt, closing thoughts as we get ready to move towards questions and answers.
Yeah, I'm grateful personally to have exposure to such a great industry that, again, I consider frontline workers. And I just want to be complimentary to working alongside a lot of dentists this year. You guys just did a great job taking good care of people in a very difficult time. And I know it's been a stressful year for a lot of owners and a lot of dentists. I do really hope that everybody gets time next year if they didn't get time this year to take some time to recharge their batteries, get some vacations in. But again, I've never been more bullish on the dental industry than I am today. I really do believe it is thriving. I really do believe that dentists that have really just worked very hard to build practices today have been rewarded for it, especially in a 2020 year. So again, if I can be an encouragement to anybody on this call today is, again, thank you for what you've done for our world in a very trying year, and putting yourselves out there and taking good care of people's oral health, I think is very important. So, yep, I think we're ready for some questions, maybe, Todd.
No, really, Matt, that was well said. I agree with you completely that once again, the resilience of the dental industry shows through. I was in a conversation with a regional bank manager a few days ago, and he reminded me that in the dental industry, success rate is 99.83%, which is astounding. And it just shows how strong at the core the dental industry is. And I wanted to thank as well all the dentists that are on this call for the hard work in maintaining people's health through a really tricky time. So let me see, Matt, what we got question-wise. I'll just read them out loud, and then we'll figure out between the two of us or both of us how we're going to answer these. When one owns the building as well as the practice, is there a separate deal, or is the real estate always part of the sale of the practice? I'll throw a little bit out there, Matt, and then if you want to add in as well. Yeah, so real estate is actually handled separately. It's a separate loan and a separate transaction. It's obviously the seller's choice as to whether they want to include it as a package deal for the buyer, or if they want to retain ownership and lease it to the buyer for a certain period of time to have an annuity of income following after the sale. We always think along the lines of you've got a captured audience right there of who wants to buy it. So it's an ideal time to sell it. And again, it allows you to kind of get away from it completely. You're not having to act as a property manager for whatever length of time is determined. But Matt, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so from a valuation perspective, I'm typically only valuing the operations of the practice. So if you own the building, the way that we get the building out of the equation is we basically act like a third party owns that piece of real estate. Because again, as the owner, you can pay yourself whatever rent you want. So again, the way we get the building out of my valuation is to say, if any other landlord owned that building, what would they charge the practice for use of that space? So again, my valuation tries to pinpoint what is the practice worth, and then obviously, usually a bank will help set the price when they do their valuation or their appraisal of the building as part of transaction. The only thing I would add is there is sometimes, even if you want to sell your building initially, sometimes there is a lag, as in the banks don't want to lend all of it up front. Sometimes they will make the buyer wait a couple of years to get more firmly established, and then you can transact on the real estate. So yeah, I would say those are, I guess, my couple of thoughts on that subject.
No, yeah, and that's a good point. I do see the biggest hurdle for buyers when the property is involved is coming up with 20% down, and that's pretty universal for banks. Is that on the real estate portion of a sale, they want a down payment of 20%, and that can be a little bit of a hurdle for them. Let's see, this is a pretty interesting question. Eric Kakao asked, how can I evaluate the quality, skill, ethics of the buyer? I know of several friends who heard bad things from his former patients about the new guy. Great question, Eric. A little bit complex and not always easy to work through. We encourage at a beginning stage a resume, a CV to be submitted. We also encourage if the buyer to be able to supply um, some images and studies of cases. And when we're talking to buyers on an advisory level, we're encouraging them to start to keep track of that sort of thing. Ethics, that's a tough one. I don't know that there's any way to measure ethics until the rubber meets the road, so to speak. But I think that most importantly, and what we pivot around in a lot of ways, is the meeting between the buyer and the seller. We feel it's paramount for that meeting to take place and for it mostly to be about an interchange between the buyer and the seller. We're always present in that situation, but we usually stay pretty quiet in the background and encourage the buyer and the seller to have a good hardcore conversation, asking questions back and forth. Of course, there's a tour of the facility as well, but the real purpose of that meeting is for the seller to be able to explore who is this and what's my feeling about them as a person, the way that they're presenting themselves. Of course, that's not always, an absolute determination of who they are, but it certainly helps a fair amount to get there. So let's see. Roya asked, is it possible to sell your practice with the agreement of working there for another 5 years? Absolutely. Absolutely. So each practice is going to be unique in that situation because the practice has to be able to afford, multiple dentists. And, if you're looking at it from the perspective of a buyer, they're coming into, this is their new job. And that new job needs to be able to take care of them and their family and their expenses and have a little bit of growth in there as well. So sometimes there's only so much of a pie to be divided. But man, I would imagine you have a perspective on it as well.
Well, and this actually goes pretty well with another question that's kind of out there that I'm going to kind of pivot to as well. From Roya, she said, also, if a practice is a super GP, general practice, in other words, performs many procedures, endo, sleep apnea, Invisalign, and not just bread and butter dentistry, is it harder to find a buyer? I'd say, and again, if a lot of variables at play here, it's hard to answer these questions without a full knowledge of everything that's going on. But let's say your practice, again, doing all that stuff in-house, is $1.5 million in collections. Well, I'd say that you almost need to have some sort of transition plan for a practice like that, especially if you are going to spend time mentoring. So yeah, I would say that there's probably a 2+ year kind of transition period where the seller is going to have to stay on, because a buyer can't buy the practice and not keep those specialty type procedures that they may not have the qualifications to even do, and they need the mentorship from the seller. So in some cases, it's almost necessary to have a transition period where you are potentially an employee of the practice or an associateship of the practice after you sold it, and you have an employment agreement thereafter the transaction.
Man, I'm going to add a little bit to that because we're seeing more and more than ever, buyers that are pretty savvy that may already have bought a practice, let's say in 2017, and have been successful, perhaps with a partner in building that practice up, starting to look for their next acquisition. And they understand the mechanics of practices like that, and are hungry for them. More and more, we're seeing buyers who have a certain vision and understand the value of those specialty services being offered within a practice. So I agree with what you're saying, but at the same time, we're starting to see a segment of buyers who are hungry for that type of a practice to pursue. Let's see. Here's an interesting question, and we'll give you as much of an answer as we can on this one. But they said, have you heard of Viper and Choice dental practice transitions? And we have, we've had conversations with them before. These are DSOs that are big on putting up upfront promises of of multiple times their prior year collection in offers to buy their practice. So they manage, they're kind of middle ground people who manage buyers and sellers looking for DSOs to buy practices, and are really in these cases betting on the idea that the DSO will collect a certain number of practices, and then at a point have an equity event, meaning that they'll sell that group of practices off for an increased value from the collective of what those practices were paid for. We think, in my opinion, again, this is just my opinion, it's a high risk situation. They're promising something that isn't necessarily a sure thing. We believe that really in any DSO transaction, and we focus primarily on private practice, but we can't help be touching and be in the world of DSOs a little bit because of their activity level. But we think it's important to be comfortable with the amount of money that the DSO offers up front, as opposed to looking, hey, this is going to be your future payoff, or we're going to offer you $1 million, but we're going to hold back 300,000 of it in order to guarantee that you stay for 3 years with us and perform at the current level, or perhaps even grow it to a certain metrics over those 3 years. We think that in those type of deals, the buyer should be comfortable with the upfront amount in case something unpredictable occurs after that, and they don't have an opportunity to earn back what has been held by the DSO in that offer. But yeah, that was a good question. Appreciate that. Let's see, Matt. Can you comment on a family member, my son, who is actively producing in the practice, and his part of the equity of the practice and an equitable transfer to him? Matt, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, great question. And again, all general statements, just knowing what little we do know. But specifically, you've got your son is in the practice, and this is a gray area in transactions. As some associates say they shouldn't pay a dime for any growth that they've added to the practice, and some sellers say you absolutely should pay me for every dollar of growth that I brought to a practice. So let's say your son started 2 years ago, and the practice grew from $1 million collection practice to a $1.5 million practice. Again, you are in control here. You can either value the practice as a $1.5 million practice or a $1 million practice. Again, some of the more family type transactions that I've worked on, sometimes the parent, the owner, will value it prior to the son or daughter entering the practice, just to keep it as friendly as possible. Whenever there's family involved, it gets a little bit more interesting. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, again, a third-party valuation would be important there, just to set, a fair value for the practice. And then obviously the negotiations can ensue after that. So again, hopefully I answered that question for you, David. If there's any follow-up, I'd be happy to provide it.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you. Let's see. Tips on communication to patients from George. Thanks, George. Tips on communication to patients when the seller is staying part-time as an associate and to facilitate the transition. Again, great question. That's actually a really powerful way to transition a practice, for the mere fact that you're present in the office. We believe strongly in a letter right at the time of the closing, so just a day, or even right, the same day of the closing or a couple days after. A powerful, strong, well-written letter from your perspective, from your heart, sharing with your patients your decision and your endorsement of the dentist who's going to be taking over. Sometimes it can be just from the mere fact of, hey, listen, I've gotten to that age where I'm ready to transfer some of the responsibilities to the new dentist, and this is who I picked. You know, in the situation where you're staying, you get to add the fact that, hey, I'll be here, and you still see my face, but you'll also be introduced to the new, you know, Dr. X, Dr. Buyer. The tricky part, George, is as you're in the office from the buyer's perspective, there's a potential for there to become a little bit of this kind of gray area of the patient wanting to see you versus wanting to see the new dentist. And again, if we put ourselves in the shoes of the new owner, they're looking to transfer and to take control of that goodwill. And it can be a little bit of a hurdle, a little bit of a struggle sometimes when patients really want to veer back over to what they know and what they're comfortable with. So it's important for you and your staff to be on the same page of endorsing and moving the patient over to the new dentist and giving them your trust. So I hope that's helpful a little bit for you. Matt, I don't know if this is too much of a question for this call, but what is the general equation that is used to determine the value of a practice? I know that's a pretty deep and broad answer, but do you want to?
Yeah, we could probably do a whole webinar on that in itself.
A couple hours, right? A couple hours.
You know, at the end of the day, to simplify it greatly, is to look at the practice, collections minus the expenses of the practice. And when I mean the expenses of the practice, that's minus any way that the owner compensates themselves. So if that's a pension plan, we take out the portion of the pension plan that's attributable to the owner. If there's a life insurance policy that's not really necessary for the practice, we take that out. If there's a Maserati in the practice, we take out the Maserati lease. You know, again, trying to get to the true operations of the practice. And again, if the building is owned, we adjust the rent of the building. Those types of adjustments to get to what we call, if a buyer bought this practice and didn't pay themselves a dime, what would the practice generate at the end of the day? The next part of the equation and actually corresponds pretty well with an email from somebody that couldn't attend today, but that question was, when buying in a partnership, is the current condition of the physician office taken into consideration? I think they're alluding to, hey, if the equipment's 20 years old, is that going to impact the valuation? Well, yes. That's where, and then that's the step that fits in next, is after we get to the true expenses, take that minus the true collections, we come up with the cash left over that would go into the bank account if the owner didn't pay themselves a dime. Well, then we got to replace equipment. And again, if the equipment is older, that capital expenditure budget is the fancy accounting term for it, increases. Or if it's brand new showroom quality, you know, equipment, then maybe the expense goes down a little bit. But again, there's a capital expenditure budget that comes out. We add back some non-cash items. We get to this thing called cash flow. And then what we do is try to figure out if we went out into the marketplace and replaced all the clinical work of the dentist, what would that cost us? Is that 35% of collections? Or if it's a specialty practice, maybe it's 40% of collections, or maybe it's bread and butter dentistry and it's 30% collection. Whatever that owner compensation adjustment is, we take, so let's say it's $1 million practice, there's $300,000 left over after expenses. We take out $20,000 for capital expenditures, so we've got 180, and then it costs $100,000 for the owner to do, you know, for a dentist to do the work. $100,000 is left over. That's what we call cash flow. Cash flow is kind of in most cases, is the primary driver of value in I would say 90% of our valuations, or basically for every healthy dental practice that we look at. So again, sorry, I can't go into more detail on that, but that's in general the high level understanding of how a practice is valued in most cases.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. We have one other question that was, can we share our contact information? And I'll put up a slide here in just a few minutes. We're going to wrap up. And in closing, I'd put forth that both Matt and I and Cheryl, we're here, DDS Match and Blue & Company, as a resource. We're always available for conversation to explore thoughts and ideas around transitions and how we can help. I'll put a slide of our contact information up here. And if there's any questions or any direct need for Matt, we'll act as a facilitator and connect you with Matt to take it from there. But I think that's about it for questions right now. And Matt, anything you want to add in closing?
Appreciate the MSDA for having us on, and again, for all the attendees and the people that watch us in the future. Again, we stand ready to help, either help you plan, facilitate a transaction, value a practice. Again, I have way too much fun with numbers as a CPA, so this is just how I have fun.
And I do want to mention that not everybody that works at Blue & Company or DDS Match has a shaved bald head. It just is a coincidence that Matt and I happen to have the same hairstylist. But thank you so much for joining us, and appreciate your participation. And thank you to MSDA and MSDA Foundation. We always love giving back to them and giving back to the dental community. So thank you, and take care, everybody.